execute the powers and trust reposed in me as Premier and President of the Executive Council.
I, Kathleen O'Day Wynne, swear that I will duly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge,
execute the powers and trust
reposed in me
as Minister of Community and Social Services
of the Province of Ontario.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the new Executive Council of Ontario.
That was the scene just next to the grand staircase in the main foyer at Queen's Park earlier this afternoon, as Premier Dalton McGuinty did something that no Liberal Premier in the province of Ontario has done in 128 years, namely swear in a third ministry. This is the first time that a Liberal has won back-to-back-to-back election victories since Oliver Mowat did it near the end of the 19th century. So it's a bit of an historic day for the Liberals, and to that end, we're going to talk about this more on our debate. And here's our cast of characters tonight. In the nation's capital, Steve Applin, Vice President at the energy consulting firm, the HDP Group. And with us here in studio, Elise Herzig, President and CEO of the Ontario Energy Association. Will Stewart, Principal at Navigator Limited, that's a public affairs and communications consulting firm. And Polino Koliakovo, Managing Director at Morrison Park Advisors, an independent investment bank. Good to have everybody around the table here. Steve Applin, good to have you on the line from Ottawa as always. I want to start by just picking up on something that Brad Dogood and I were talking about, which was what role energy played in the results of the last election. And to that end, let me read something off the top here from a group called Wind Concerns Ontario, which are not happy with the windmills going up all over the place. And they said each rural riding with an incumbent Liberal MPP was targeted, including those of Ministers Carol Mitchell, Leona Dombrowski, and John Wilkinson, and some were visited numerous times leading up to the election. In addition, WCO members worked also to provide support to existing incumbent PCs. The momentum and impact of Wind Concerns Ontario's work in these ridings was clearly responsible for the results. Let's get into that. Will Stewart, you used to be a Chief of Staff to a Minister of Energy,
yes,
maybe a decade and a half ago. Are these folks right? Did they take down those three cabinet ministers?
I think it'd be very difficult to say that single-handedly they brought down those cabinet ministers, but I think it is fair to say that they certainly contributed to their downfall. And I don't think it was because they were rabble-rousing or being quoted in the local newspaper. What I actually think matters is in campaigns, people matter. And I think it motivated a group of people, namely farmers and others who didn't like to see wind turbines in their area for whatever reason, actually got out and onto the hustings. They handed out literature, they knocked on doors, they actually provided some of the sweat labor that makes campaigns run in Ontario. And I think that certainly contributed to it, because they otherwise wouldn't have done that.
From your perch, Steve Applin, in Eastern Ontario, did it look like energy had a significant role in the outcome of the election?
Yeah, to me it did. The Premier really talked up the Green Energy Act. And Wind Concerns Ontario, yeah, they're a very active organization. I thought they were pretty effective in playing the media. They got a lot of stuff on CBC. And you know, there were 7 rural ministers, Liberal or not Liberal members who lost, and wind turbines were a big issue across that whole area. So yeah, I think that it did play a role.
Elise, how do you see it?
We see it a little bit differently in that a few months ago, energy seemed to be the #1 concern of voters. We saw that on your agenda camp when you were going from city to city. And then what happened is closer to the election, 5 core issues came up and energy wasn't part of them. But what was interesting is that jobs and the economy was. So on that level, the Green Energy Act did promote things that gave a message to the public that we're pretty stable compared to what's happening in Greece or in other jurisdictions.
Polino, how about you?
If you look at the difference between the 2007 and 2011 elections, the Liberal government lost 18 seats. 5 of those are in urban ridings, 3 are in the north, and 10, broadly speaking, were in rural areas across Ontario. And a number of those rural seats don't have wind turbines in them or proposed wind farms. I mean, it's reasonable to say that in a few of those ridings, you know, there might have been a bit of a swing that came from the efforts of that group. But to make a blanket statement that all rural ridings were affected by this, I think is going a bit too far.
A little more complex than that. Well, let me pick up on the conventional wisdom, because I thought, Will, to you first on this, I thought some of rural Ontario loved the Green Energy Act because all those farmers were signing big contracts, you know, feed-in tariff contracts. They were going to get paid a lot of money, certainly more than market rates, in order to plug in and get those renewables going, signing long-term contracts with Ontario Power Generation and so on, and then laugh all the way to the bank. Yep. Now that should have been, if that's true, they should have voted Liberal. So how come,
Well,
is that not true?
I think the people who got the contracts and the people who have the turbines on their fields, they're farmers, I think, yeah, they're probably happy with this. But you look at everybody else that doesn't have them up and they see it as infringing on their property values, dropping their property values and not being able to have the same sight lines that they had before. And I think people got pretty worked up about it. The wind turbines are usually clustered together in some measure and not everybody gets one. I think it absolutely played a role. You only have to drive through parts of rural Ontario to see the Stop the Wind Turbines signs. They're in virtually every small community outside of the 416 when you drive around. They've been up for years, and people were pretty upset about it. So it wasn't a blanket approval of these things. The second factor, I think, is that people didn't have a choice. The municipal councils, because of the Green Energy Act, the municipal councils, the mayors, the reeves, right across this province, weren't giving the planning authority anymore to be able to say, no, we don't want them in our community. All of those decisions rested in downtown Toronto. That gave the mayors and the councils free rein to oppose those things vocally and often. And I think that led to some of the public support waning on windmills.
Elise, did you hear that too? The irritants that local authorities didn't have enough authority?
I think it's really going back to the process of how do we engage communities in a meaningful way. If we're going to call it a consultation process, let it be a consultation process.
You really got to consult.
Exactly. And so I think we've learned from the recent decisions that we've all seen that something's wrong with the system, and I think there's opportunities now for us to fix it.
Steve Applin, help me with this though, because theoretically, if you've got big windmills or whatever, some kind of new renewable project on your property values are going to go up, whether it's on a farmer's field or whether it's along, the shores of Lake Huron, and the municipality should be realizing a lot more revenue as a result. Now, again, wouldn't that make this popular?
Perhaps, but I think what Will said has some relevance. Not everybody benefited from this, just a few did. And the people who didn't, it's not like they all bid on it and the losers are sore losers. I think that just by its nature, only a few people can get these things. They're huge, they're very visible. And once people, and not only are they very visible, and with all the aspects that go along with having them physically in your neighborhood, there are other aspects to wind turbines as well that other people don't like, and it's just, we're paying a lot of money for the electricity that they produce. The electricity is low quality. We can get high quality electricity that's much more reliable from other sources, and I think that the people in those areas might have taken a much more critical view, and that might have played a role in local opposition to them.
Paulino, one thing we've almost always seen in the past, when energy comes up as a topic in an election campaign, it's almost always bad. It's almost always bad news. People are complaining about high prices or whatever. The way you looked at it this time, energy did come up during the election campaign. Was it always a bad news story?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think the Premier was singularly successful in taking energy and making it into a positive for the government in the campaign. I don't think that's ever been done, to be honest with you. Certainly not in Ontario, and I don't think in very many other jurisdictions where energy issues were treated as a positive by an incumbent government that actually got reelected.
Elise, how do you see that?
For us, what we're looking at when we're talking to the voters and to the public is that it really depends on how much they understand and what it really means to them. So people want secure, reliable, sustainable energy. And it's a challenge in the province for the Premier and for the Minister to juggle the environmental, the economic, and the social needs. And I think the Premier did an excellent job on his part, sharing with the public a lot of the good that's been happening. And we're in a much better place today than we were 8 years ago. And I think that's something people remember.
8 years ago, were you working for the Ernie Eves government at that time?
I worked for the Mike Harris government and the Ernie Eves government at the end, yes.
Everything at the end. So energy did come up as an issue in those campaigns.
I have the scars on my back to show for it.
I was going to say, it wasn't good news when it came up back then.
No, it wasn't.
But did you think it was partially a good news story this time around?
I don't think so. I mean, I think anytime you're talking about electricity issues on the virtue of price, on technology, I think it's to Lisa's point, the public's understanding of these issues is very, very low. I think as an industry, we all have to do better in educating folks on that. And I think it really goes bad when things like, as John Ivison in the National Post reported, they went to the solar plant after the Premier was there as the hallmark announcement in the campaign about solar energy, and it turns out it's actually closed, and it's not manufacturing, it's assembly, and it's not high paid, it's minimum wage plus 10%. I think the public's confidence further gets eroded when Dalton McGuinty and the Liberals defend a power plant for 6 or 7 years in Mississauga, and then 11 days before a vote, they cancel it because all of a sudden there are apparently condos in the neighborhood. Well, I think the condos were there in advance of 11 days before the vote.
We're going to talk about that
and
too.
I think all of that goes a long way to making the public cynical about energy. And when you're talking about it in terms of the partisan terms, there are serious decisions that need to be made that are just clouded by politics, and that's what we saw in the campaign.
Steve, as you looked at it from Ottawa, yeah, go ahead.
And there was bad news coming from south of the border as well. There was the Solyndra absolute fiasco, a huge embarrassment for the United States president, and that coincided pretty much with the Ontario election campaign. So there's a little bit of that as well.
You should just take 30 seconds and remind everybody about the $500 million headache that Solyndra now represents for Barack Obama. Tell everybody what that was about, Steve.
Yeah, it's part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which was signed under George W. Bush. Clean energy, which includes solar, nuclear, and other things, is supposed to get loan guarantees from the U.S. federal government, which it did. Solyndra applied for one, got one, and no sooner had they received it than they basically defaulted on it. That was in early September of this year, and this was a very big embarrassment for President Obama and Vice President Biden because they had toured the plant. They touted this as part of the new energy economy, exactly as the Ontario Premier is doing, exactly. And the thing went bust, and not only did it go bust, but people were saying, we told you so before you even signed the loan guarantee. It was a huge embarrassment. And it's not the only solar and wind company that's gone bust in the United States. There's another one called Evergreen Solar, another one called SpectraWatt, BP Solar, and then we had this one, Eclipsol, in Scarborough.
There were a number of people, Polino, who thought Premier McGuinty would just try to low-bridge that whole green energy issue before the campaign started because it was so controversial. But he doubled down on it.
Absolutely.
Did you think he was crazy to double down on it when he did?
Well, look, traditionally, the problem for governments on energy issues have been things like price volatility and supply, keeping the lights on. The fact of the matter is the government's efforts, particularly in the first 4 years of government, addressed those issues. There was a bunch of new supply was built in the province. More is on the way because of contracts that were handed out. We don't have a keeping the lights on problem. There isn't a supply problem now. Moreover, the province's market, which had been opened and closed under the Harris government, that issue was settled. The RPP was put into place.
RPP?
The price plan for Ontarians, the regulated price plan. So people have an understanding of what prices are going to be. The OEB publicizes them every 6 months. So you don't have volatility. Well, when you take supply and volatility out of the picture, it gave the Premier the freedom to focus on jobs and the environment. And that's really what he did. He focused on jobs and the environment for the past 4 years, and they became a positive story on energy instead of a negative story.
We are not a cynical program here. However, there was to be a gas-fired energy plant built in Oakville, and it was canceled by the McGuinty Liberals a year ago. They said they didn't need it anymore. Huzzah, huzzah, the Liberals held the seat in the election campaign. There was to be a gas-fired energy plant in Mississauga. It was canceled by the McGuinty Liberals, as you pointed out, Will, 11 days before Election Day. Shock of all shocks, the Liberals held that seat and all the ones around it as well. We're not cynics here, but tell us, Will, why were those projects canceled?
Pure politics. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Kevin Flynn was facing a very serious challenge to his re-election. He had promised a hospital twice and it hadn't been built. Conveniently, ground broke just in advance of the election. The power plant was canceled in Oakville soon thereafter. Again, in Mississauga, the power plant was canceled. And I think it's important to note, these weren't like hypotheticals or maybe we'll put a plant there or we're thinking about that it might be one in the future. These were power plants that had signed contracts with the McGuinty government. They had gone through the regulatory process. They had gone through the OMB.
There's construction crews in place in Mississauga.
In the case of Mississauga, concrete was being poured. I would also point out, after McGuinty canceled it in the campaign, concrete continued to be poured every single day as people showed up for work. But this is, joking aside, this is a serious issue. There's no sanctity of a contract.
Hold on, we're going to get to sanctity of contract. I want to understand, first of all, Steve Applin, tell me, is there any reason other than politics that those two gas-fired plants were canceled?
The minister said that they didn't need the power. He's kind of right. Polino mentioned that we don't have a big supply problem. We actually don't. And guess where 6,000 megawatts of that supply is? It's at Nanticoke and Lambton. We do not have a supply issue in Ontario in the near term. So on that level, they're right. But no, it was pure politics. They canceled these plants because they were unpopular in the areas where they're going to go in. And they probably quite rightly felt that they might suffer electorally if they go ahead with them.
Is there any argument, at least, to be said that on the merits these decisions were made?
Well, first of all, I'd like to go back to the Mississauga plant because that one was different than the Oakville one. And the Mississauga plant, 24 hours after the Premier made his announcement, the Conservative leader also said that he would not build a plant there, and the NDP leader said she would also not build that plant there. So it's very hard to claim that an election was won by the Liberals if all three parties agreed they weren't going to build the plant. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if there's any merit out of this, if you can try and find some good out of it, is the Premier has committed. We heard yesterday from Sousa, from the local MPP, Charles Sousa, that he said that there was mistakes made along the way, and it's time to rectify those mistakes. And they're calling to put together a provincial framework that we should really rethink how we put these locations in place for all power plants and bring the right people to the table early on. So the stakeholders would include the communities, organizations such as ourselves, the larger energy community. And if they could do that, that would be great. But the fact of the matter is, every time you cancel a plant, there are costs that are not only terrible costs, but they're costs to the ratepayers that have no value. So you're paying for something, of a cancellation of a contract or moving a facility that you derive no benefit from, and for sure, you know that the next contract that comes in place is going to have a different risk factor put into it, and it's going to be more expensive.
Hold off, more on that to come. You guys are anticipating the third part of our discussion tonight. Hold on, don't go too far ahead of me here. In that chair, Will, Monday night, sat Chris White from the Rural Ontario Institute, and he raised the idea that when it comes to energy policy in this province, there's a double standard. Watch this clip of that program and then we'll come back and talk. Michael, roll tape, please.
You look at the green legislation, for example, the Green Energy Act was a real divider out in rural Ontario. You had windmills going up that were problematic, pitting folks against folks, and there were different arguments about health and so on. But in Toronto, when you wanted to put some windmills off Scarborough, they were delayed. The gas plants in Mississauga and Oakville were both delayed or canceled. So you see a different response to different legislation coming out of the province.
Is there a double standard?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't see how anybody could conclude otherwise. And just to take one step back, and then I'll answer the question. Everyone's saying we don't need supply. Well, we don't need supply today, but people forget that in 2014, our main source of supply, 50% of our electricity in Ontario, goes offline for retrofit. The nuclear plants come down, and we've got to replace that 50% somehow. And if we don't start thinking about that now, in terms of gas plants or new nuclear, we're going to have big trouble. But there is a big divide in Ontario. And it's helpful when you look at a seat map, not to look at it in terms of red seats and blue seats, but think about it in terms of those who are less impacted by the economic downturn in Ontario and those more impacted by the economic downturn in Ontario. And I think that those outside of the 416 were more impacted by it. And I think that they voted Conservative for a series of reasons. Those within 416 and other urban centres voted Liberal for another reason. But I don't know how you can possibly conclude that there's not a double standard. Wind turbines, the people, local communities, local elected officials have no say in where wind turbines are sited. They have no say on when solar panels are sited. Yet inside of 416, if you can cause some pain for the government, if you can get your name in the newspaper, all of a sudden those plants come tumbling down.
Steve, double standard?
Kind of. There's another plant that we haven't mentioned. This is the Holland Marsh Peaker plant. I'm not sure whether it's in Newmarket, Aurora, or the riding just to the north of that, which I think is.
I think it's York North. I think it's Julia Monroe's riding.
Yeah.
It's a Conservative held riding.
And it impacts Newmarket, Aurora, also Conservative held. The local Farm Growers Association was not happy with that. They felt that got foisted on them, and that's another sort of thing that might have played in rural ridings where people might have sympathized with those farmers and seen how they were trampled on, or they felt that they had been trampled on, and that might have been another thing that sort of fed this rural backlash against the Liberals.
Double standard, Polino?
I would like to point out that there is a 1,000 megawatt electricity plant in downtown Toronto It's the Portland's Energy Center. It's right in the middle of the waterfront. There's a lovely high tower that's up above it. If you're in any building in downtown Toronto, you can see it. It's right there. I would also point out that the offshore wind turbines, yes, they were canceled when they were offshore of Toronto, but they were also canceled because of opposition in places like Sault Ste. Marie, where they didn't want to see offshore wind turbines up there either. So, I mean, it's just getting a little bit too easy to say that there's a difference between urban and rural, because Portland's Energy Center did go ahead. And there was quite a bit of opposition in the city of Toronto that the government didn't pay attention to, because that plant was actually required. It was a necessity for local reliability. It went up.
Well, let's ask the bottom line question here, Elise. Do these plants need to be near the populations they serve?
So it really depends. We've got to balance three things. There's the economic, the environmental, and the social. And there are things that we can do economically that are going to be more expensive depending on how we do it. So we have to balance all those things. This is not an easy portfolio. And there's decisions that we've got to make that are short-term decisions and ones that are long lead times like nuclear. And so you're trying to juggle this short-term, the long-term, manage the costs, keep it affordable to the ratepayer. By the way, pay for some of these changes that we've made along the way. And so it's a very difficult decision. And
which is why Brad Dogood's happy he's not the Minister of Energy anymore, as I suggested to him earlier. But okay, Steve, come on here and tell me. I appreciate the way Elise has laid it out, but I mean, the question remains, do these plants have to be near the populations they serve?
Well, in some cases, it's felt that they do need to be near the load center. It's either that or a big transmission line, and you've got local concerns to deal with either way, and that's the theme of this election is essentially is local opposition to energy projects. You've got local opposition in Oakville, Mississauga. There's also a gas plant killed in Woodbridge a few years ago as well. Local opposition to all those. Local opposition to wind turbines. The government might start looking for, wonder where is there a welcoming host community, and there are welcoming host communities, and it would require a little bit more transmission, but that could be done. You could double the capacity of the nuclear plants, for example, without appreciably changing the physical footprints that they're on, and that might solve one of the problems. But as Elise said, you've got a longer lead time, and that's one of the considerations.
I think I'm right in saying this. Listen, I'm sure there's exceptions, but Paulino, most of the people who live near most of the nuclear facilities in this province seem to be content with them. There's not the kind of unhappiness with them that that you might see with some of the projects we're talking about here.
That's absolutely right.
Why would that be the case for nuclear plants, but not for gas-fired or windmills or whatever?
Well, a crass and simple answer is an awful lot of people work at nuclear plants. Nuclear plants are very labor intensive. You don't really think about it that way, but there's hundreds and hundreds of people, frankly, actually, I think over 1,000, working at the Bruce nuclear plant and at the Darlington plant, maybe a little bit less at the Pickering plant. So they live in the community. And there's a lot of community support for the people who work there, and there's a lot of business that comes out of the fact that those plants are there. Contrast that to a gas plant where you might have 50 people working in a 1,000-megawatt gas plant. It's just a very different kind of business.
Gotcha. Now, Will, let's be clear about what's happening here.
High-quality jobs, too, especially in places like Kincardine, where there isn't another industry like that.
The Oakville plant, the government said they're canceling. We don't need it anymore, that's it. But Mississauga, they have adamantly maintained, we're not breaking a contract, we're not canceling it, we're going to move it somewhere else.
But isn't that a little bit of an unfair surprise for the rest of the electorate that now didn't get a chance to vote on whether or not they have an electricity plant in their area?
Well, where's it going to go?
Where's it going to go is a good question. And the Oakville plant, they didn't say we don't need the plant. They said we can solve the solution with transmission lines. And it was raised earlier, transmission lines go through a number of communities, not a power plant in just one community. We're trying to build new transmission lines to get some of that power that we're generating at the Bruce nuclear plant down to where the load is, down to where people like you and the rest of your guests here tonight use the electricity. And you know what? We can't get that transmission line built because it goes through a lot of communities. I think the decision to cancel these plants or move these plants or solve them other ways is going to come back to hurt Dalton McGuinty, both politically and financially. Financial, we've talked about. Politically, he's given full license to those NIMBY activists across the province, including the NIMBY activists who will oppose transmission lines in their community. And it's going to be very, very difficult for him to do that.
Would opposition to transmission lines be as intense as it has been to the the gas-fired plants?
Well, I grew up in Scarborough, and we had a huge hydro corridor going right through the middle of the town, and then the city, and then as part of the mega city. And I know that everybody viewed those transmission lines as skeptical. People moved in beside existing transmission lines and then became opponents of those transmission lines. So I think, yeah, I think people are going to be upset about it when they see these lines and the questions that go along with that going right through their community. Absolutely.
Here's, I guess, the overarching question, at least, which is, we want the lights to stay on. We need, reasonably priced power to motor this economy. But we don't want any of this stuff within eyesight, earshot, 100 yards of our communities. What's the answer?
It's a challenge. You know what? I always tell people, look at your briefcase and see how many chargers you have for all your different things. And you expect wherever you go in Ontario that you'll be able to charge in, but you don't want, as you said, the transmission lines to the plants nearby. The problem is we're going to have to make some tough choices. And we're going to have to you can solve any problem with time or money, but we don't have unlimited time and we don't have unlimited money. And we have that issue. It goes back to the basics. How do we balance the economic, the environmental, and the social? The long-term energy plan that a lot of the sector was very involved in putting forth try to create that balance, the balance of the economics, the balance of the social, the balance of the environment. And now what we're doing is we're going back and saying, okay, maybe some of those decisions we've made are not going to be accepted. Do we have to go back, and what's that new price tag going to be? And ultimately, you need public support for these projects. And more importantly, or maybe equally importantly, once you choose a path, you got to stick with it, because we can't afford these surprise bills. Anybody who's done a renovation in their house or in their basement, and you find out that the prices keep on increasing and increasing and increasing, no one wants to go through that. Well, that's what we go through in this sector all the time.
Steve, let me try a what if with you, and you tell me if this makes any sense. The federal government, I think it was yesterday, announced billions and billions of dollars in shipbuilding contracts, much of which went to New Brunswick. And, while some people in Quebec were Nova Scotia, Halifax. And while, some people in Quebec obviously were unhappy they didn't get their share of what they thought was the contract, it was hard to argue against it because the decision was taken away from politicians and given to a kind of a blind panel of bureaucrats, and they just looked at the numbers and they made the hard, fast choices without politics coming into it. Do we need to do that for energy in Ontario?
It sure would be nice if we got a bunch of engineers, but then, of course, the nuclear engineers would say, well, there should be nuclear engineers, and that kind of stuff. But yes, it would be nice to have an independent, technically minded, panel of bean counters that look at the dollars and cents. If we had that, we would not have the Green Energy Act. What
about that, Paulino? Is that an option?
I hate to say, but that's how we got the Oakville plant.
We got it because it was a...
Absolutely. It was not a political decision. I mean, the fact of the matter was the Southwest GTA needs either power or transmission. There was a review. They decided that power made more sense than transmission. There was a competition. There were a half dozen different companies that proposed plants. And the Oakville plant was the cheapest plant that fit the bill that was going to provide the power that was needed in that area. It wasn't politically motivated. There were no politicians involved. It was a straight dollars and cents decisions. There was a fairness commissioner. It was all done under the auspices of the Ontario Power Authority. And the conclusion of it was the Oakville power plant. Now, public opposition has effectively killed that. They're still going to have to solve the problem of power in the Southwest GTA. It's likely going to have to be transmission. The opposite thing happened 5 years ago. When I was working for the Minister of Energy, Hydro One proposed a transmission line into Northern York region because there was a local power supply problem there. Tremendous opposition to that new line being put in place. The result was the line got cancelled, and instead they decided to build a power plant. And that was the Holland Marsh power plant that Steve mentioned before that there's a lot of controversy about. The reality is people don't want either.
Is it at all possible, Will, can you imagine a politician saying, this has just gotten out of hand, so we're going to stay out of it. We're just going to let the technical experts make the decision, and people, if you don't like it, tough. We're keeping it out of politics, otherwise it's never going to get done. Can you do that?
I think Elise already knows what I'm about to say. At every energy speech for the last number of years, every energy conference, every cocktail reception, every time you see an energy person on the street, they say, why can we not get politics out of the energy sector? And I contend until the energy sector learns how to manage its own politics, the politicians are going to do it for you. And some of the structures you're talking about, independent, technical-minded people who be able to address these issues. For my money, the IESO is the holder of all the information. Independent Electricity System Operator. We love acronyms in this industry.
We hate them on this show.
Yeah, they hold all the technical data. They know who uses what and when, and those are the type of folks that need to be at the table and making these decisions, along with the Ontario Energy Board, not a minister sitting at Queen's Park firing up the directive machine.
However, could you at least get public buy-in if it was a technical panel that made the decision divorced from politics?
I think as long as you, in a meaningful way, engage the communities. I think we have to do a better job on energy education, and it's not just the job of the government, it's also the job of the sector. And we've not done a very good job at it, and we recognize that, and that's something we know we have to improve upon. But I think it really boils down to people feeling that they were involved, and that they were heard, and they were listened to, and that was taken into account. And that's been missing.
Does the gamesmanship of short-term politics, which will certainly be exacerbated, I would think, in a minority parliament, work against rational long-term planning? Steve Applin, tackle that first, if you would.
It does. Well, we're talking about electricity. Electricity is always, from its inception of the early utility industries, this was a public issue. It was a it was a regulated utility because it was recognized as a public good. It is still a public good. We've got a sort of halfway deregulated, quote, deregulated system in Ontario. There's no way, when I said that it would be nice to have an independent panel, that's a brave new world that's never going to happen. This is politics. We're never going to take this out. There's a lot of money that goes into it. It's public money, and we live in a democracy. We're never going to get rid of that. We just have to deal with it and manage with it.
Will, does the minority parliament make the gamesmanship around this even worse?
I think it does, but not for the reason that many think it does. It's not a matter of the votes in the legislature. It's not a matter of one party proposing a bill or another. I think that could play a role if people want to get into brinksmanship. But I think the bigger issue is, what does the Liberal Party of Ontario do to win back some of the rural support that they've lost? What does the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario do to win some of those votes within 416? And I think that the past is not prologue on this issue. I think both parties are going to have to amend their policies on a number of fronts, including on electricity policy, if they hope to make that breakthrough to a majority government the next time we're at the polls.
Okay, we've got about 8 minutes to go here, and I want to do one last thing with all you guys, and that is the sanctity of a contract. Let's talk about this. Get comfortable. I got a long wind up here. Contracts with the gas plant manufacturers in Oakville and Mississauga were unilaterally scrapped by the McGuinty government. Had the Tories won, they would have unilaterally scrapped the $7 billion Samsung deal. Had the Tories or NDP won, they would have unilaterally scrapped the GO Train refurbishment deal signed with Canada Allied Diesel based in Lachine, Quebec, because they didn't want the business going to Quebec, they wanted it going to North Bay. Former Premier Mike Harris opened the energy market. Former Premier Ernie Eves closed it a few years later, capping prices, presumably scaring away some investors in the process. Okay, question. Steve Applin first. Are contracts signed by the Ontario government worth the paper they're printed on anymore?
Well, not any more than any other jurisdiction, like I said, that is a democracy where these things are public issues and it involves public money and hence a lot of partisan cleavage. When, if one of these companies signs a contract with the government, they've done their due diligence, they know whether it's a public issue or not. They're big boys and they know that they're getting into that this is basically par for the course in any jurisdiction that they're going to set up shop, and Ontario's no different in that respect.
Paulina, would you advise your clients who want to spend perhaps tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on energy transmission or energy generation in the province of Ontario, would you advise them not to come here because you just can't, a handshake's not a handshake anymore?
A handshake was never a handshake, and the contracts are written to take into account that possibility. The real fact of the matter is governments are not breaking these contracts with no compensation. Everyone in government takes the situation very seriously because they know if they are going to walk out on a contract, it's going to cost a fair bit of money. There is compensation built into most of these contracts. And even if it's not explicit, the terms are written in such a fashion that the government simply can't walk away from the contract. It's been a long time since contracts were written in a way that didn't foresee that possibility.
Will?
Yeah, I think we've got a problem on our hands in Ontario, and I think it's equally applicable to progressive conservatives as it is to liberals. To be absolutely fair, we have a problem. You also forgot that Dalton McGuinty campaigned in 2003 on tearing up the 407 contract and bringing it back. It never ended up happening. But Paulino's right. We've got a problem on our hands. These contracts are broken with some type of compensation for which the taxpayers of Ontario don't get anything for. The politics of Ontario have led to a point where the sanctity of the contract is a little less than it should be, a lot less than it should be, and I think it's a problem. I spoke with a number of energy producers recently at an Ontario Energy Association event where they said, you know what, for the first time in a G8 country, our international clients that are looking to build here are taking out regulatory insurance, and that's all added cost for the end-use customer, you and I, who flip the switch on the lights when they get home.
Your members, I'm going to take a wild guess here. You represent lots of different energy interests in the province of Ontario who've probably got assets in the tens of billions. Am I close?
You're correct, yeah.
I'm correct. What do they think about trying to do business in a province where contracts seem to be ripped up willy-nilly these days?
So we have actually two types of membership. The large companies that have lots of deals in front of them are going to look at, okay, here's my deal in Ontario, here's my deal in another jurisdiction, and they're going to look at the risks. And every time there is another announcement made, that risk factor of investing in Ontario goes up. And that is going to be costed in, but it's not even that.
Costed in or just declined?
So here's what's going to happen. There's two scenarios that we can see take place. The first one is, they may say, you know what, there's two deals we're looking at, let's step away from it, let's not do the Ontario deal because it's just too much of a headache. The second one is that when, even though there is compensation, and Paulino's right, there's compensation that's built into the contract, so it's not like companies walk away with nothing, it's that lost opportunity cost that irritates the companies. So for the ratepayers or taxpayers that are going to land up writing this check, it's not like these companies walk away happy because they've given up a lost period of time that they could have done another deal.
Sure.
And these are long-term projects. They're looking at returns for 15 to 30 years out. And so that's really the irritating factor, not that they're not going to get their compensation, but it changes their whole game plan. For the smaller players, for some of the international players that may not have those same opportunities, what's going to happen is they still may come into Ontario. But what the worst thing is it goes back to the best interest of the ratepayers. We're not getting the most competitive, best companies necessarily bidding for projects. So before you may have had 8 companies going after a project, maybe you'll now get 2. And what does that mean? It means that we're not getting the best decision made for our ratepayers.
Fewer options for us. Again, I have no clue, but how much would it cost to take out insurance on this kind of a, let's say on a huge project that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build?
Can't speak on that. I'm not an insurance expert, but I do know it's not only the insurance that's going to be factored in, there's going to be a whole host of other ones because every time there's a project delay, that loses time and money. So that gets built in. So there's a number of costs that just get added on, and ultimately the person that pays for that is the ratepayer. And they're not seeing a better source of energy, a cleaner source of energy, a more reliable source of energy. They're paying for the same thing, they're just paying more for it.
Okay, wait a minute. How am I doing on time here, Tina? What do we got? 2.5 minutes? Oh, the evening has gone by so quickly. Okay, try this. Steve, to you first. Has any political party that's held power in the province of Ontario over the last 20 years distinguished themselves on the electricity file?
Yeah, good question. I actually don't mind what the Liberals did, and you know, every one of them had their own sort of pressures and that kind of thing. And the lights have stayed on the whole time. Which is the bottom line. Lights have stayed on. Electricity prices haven't gone through the roof. Didn't go through the roof under the NDP or the Harris or Eves Conservatives or under the McGuinty Liberals. That's basically the bottom line. So in that case, you know, they haven't screwed things up to that extent.
The lights have stayed on, but if we had whiplash in the process trying to follow the ping pong of
we've had, well,
changes.
well, from deregulation, I would have to say that deregulation didn't live up to its early promise, which is it was going to make things simple and it was going to drop prices. It certainly isn't simpler, but the bottom line is the lights have stayed on in the province. We do have a decent supply. Will did mention that we do have a nuclear refurbishment coming up. The government has to make some sort of decision on what to do about the extension of the Pickering B nuclear station while Darlington and Bruce B get refurbished. And all these decisions have to be made. I think that they'll be made in due course, and I think that even under this minority government, some good decisions will be made, especially regarding that. Don't forget that's our most important source. Those have stayed in service. I'm talking about the nuclear units. Some of them have come back from layup and are now back in service. It's not a bad, you know, I like to complain about it, but it's the government hasn't done such a bad job. I don't like the Green Energy Act. It hasn't really,
but you're right.
It hasn't really jacked up prices all that much.
We've managed to get through the whole hour tonight, Steve, and the lights are still on, so we can say that. Can I thank Steve Applin from the HDP Group? Well, half of it by nuclear power. Okay, I hear you. From the nation's capital, we thank you very much for being there on the line for us. Will Stewart from Navigator, Elise Herzig, President and CEO of the Ontario Energy Association on that side of the table, Pelino Koliakovo, Managing Director of Morrison Park on the other side of the table. Thanks so much, everybody.